There we go.
Yes. Hi, Pat.
Hello, Miriam. How are you?
I am very well. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is awesome. I'm really excited.
Me too. I was so pumped after the exploration call already because there's so many different facets. And I must say that I've been searching for someone who can help me link the military and the world of facilitation and learning and development.
Okay. Oh, excellent. All right.
Yes. So
This
we're
is a new
gonna,
topic for you then.
yes, gonna dive a bit into that. And I always like to start at the beginning. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yes, I do. And I knew you were going to ask this question, so it was a good question to think about over the years. I probably delivered my first train. I was first a trainer way back when I was probably 17. I went to Valley Forge Military Academy, and it was a great experience. And so, in that setting, in that structure, the kids, for lack of a better term, because I was a kid at 17, the kids are really put in charge. So it's a great opportunity to very quickly develop those skills as a trainer. But when I look back on that, I think that's what I was called myself and should have called myself, because I do make a distinction between a trainer and a facilitator. So yeah, so I think and it's funny because then leaving the military and entering the corporate world, and again, I think I had roles and responsibilities as a trainer, and I think that's what I was. And it wasn't until probably because even in those times in the early and mid 90s, you didn't hear the term facilitator very often, at least in the corporate setting and in my space, was never a term that was used. You were referred to as a trainer, and there was a lot of pride that went to being a trainer.
Mm.
And so I don't think, Miriam, it was probably somewhere around the early to mid 2000s when, which also coincided with when I started transitioning into roles where I was running what at the time we called training organizations. More recently, we refer to more commonly, at least in the space that I spent my time in, learning and development. It wasn't until probably the mid 2000s that I really started to appreciate and differentiate, what is a facilitator versus a trainer. And
Mm.
so and so having said that, I would probably say I've referred to myself, I have felt comfortable to refer to myself as a facilitator for probably the last, I would say, 10 years. And a lot's happened, a lot happened before I reached that point, a lot's happened since then. But
Yeah.
probably for about the last 10 years. And I, and I like to think of myself as a very experienced, I know that there are master facilitator certifications out there, but for me, I probably started considering myself a experienced expert or master facilitator when I started garnering feedback on a 5 scale, that where I was regularly scoring a 4 9 to a perfect score.
Mm.
That to me was sort of that moment where I'm like, okay, I'm impacting the group to that level that they're looking at me, and the majority of the 20 or 25 folks in the room are scoring me a 5 or I'm
Interesting.
averaging those. Yeah, so that's probably how I'd answer that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And many things popped up in my mind listening to your story. One was a small thing you said. This was we used to refer to it as training and nowadays to learning and development. And I must
Yes.
say that I never
Yes.
thought of it like this because now I see the switch in focus from training, which is centered on the trainer, to now learning and development, which is a focus on the learner.
Yes. And I think there's the focus on the continuum. I think when we use training, we considered everything a moment in time. We are delivering something, and that is the goal. Whereas I
Mm.
think the transition to learning and development got us more into, or as a result of us getting more into the continuum of learning
And the
for,
process is the goal. So it's learning and
yes,
development is never done. Whereas a training, you do bridge a knowledge gap and then it's done.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Very interesting. Thank you. And so this was a little light bulb moment.
Yeah, oh, of course.
And you mentioned the no one further thought before I jump to the next topic is I love to hear the different answers from my guests and when they started calling themselves facilitators, and how this relates to either the internal pride or the outside appreciation, as you refer to it from the 5 points reviews, or the stamp on something that you can put on your wall. I have
Yeah,
finished a
yeah,
certification, and I find this fascinating.
yeah. For me, when you're a facilitator, to me, it's always good to be confident. And I think, when we look at, what defines I always love this discussion of what defines a professional, and a lot of people, we have this discussion. I do it often with my group, in the US, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, only about 30% of jobs require an official certification, doctors, lawyers, all that. So it begs the question of how do the rest of us, the other 70%, how do we define what it means to be a professional? And you know, I always say, and I believe, and Harvard sort of is of this opinion, that a professional is defined by somebody who's always working on getting better, who's always developing themselves, developing their skills. And so I come at facilitation from that perspective, right? I should always be developing, but at the end of the day, my skill as a facilitator is ultimately defined and determined by how the attendees and the learners view me. Was
Mm,
I impactful to them?
yeah.
So
Because that's the only purpose why we're in the room in the first place. It's to be
it's the
in
only reason we're
service
there.
of the group. Yeah. And it's so funny that you mentioned the professional aspect of it. Because when I think of professionalism, then it sounds like a list of things that you can become accredited to. And it's and for me, facilitation, like coaching, yes, there are skills. But on the other hand, it's so much more also about the inner game, the mindset, the way you show up, the presence, which is very difficult to actually train on. It's something that you mature into.
That, you know what? I was wondering where you're going with that, and I couldn't agree more when you made that statement. It's something you mature into. I think you reach a point where this is where I need to be, where my mindset's. And let's be honest, as facilitators, there are mornings, right? We're getting ready to start, and we may know I've got to get my mind in a different place. And I know a number of other facilitators who have certain things they do. So I think it's really profound as a facilitator to understand that it's so much about your mindset going
Yeah. And when I think of a strong mindset, and maybe so that's a bridge that I'm building now to the military, right?
in.
Sneaky me. Um, what have you, and let me just ask the open question, what have you learned from your time in the military where you were young and training about facilitation? What have you taken into this new life of yours?
Yeah, I think the first thing, and I was really feel I benefited from this, having started in the military, was so much of the military delivery is hands-on. I mean,
Mm.
there is very limited, there's a very limited amount, at least in the time that I was in, and now we're going back a ways, right? But very little of it was in classroom. I mean, the classroom was the stuff, okay, let's make sure you know this. And now everything was about going out and applying it, if there was even classroom included, right? Which very often our classroom was the outdoors. I mean, I certainly would say, if I look at the didactic content that I absorbed in the military as a whole, probably 70 to 80% of the didactic was absorbed in the outdoors, was absorbed outside, or in a setting that in which it was going to be applied. So I think that that's one of the things that I've always carried with me, is this notion that, you know, it's much more engaging when people are practicing, discussing, talking about how to apply it versus and I've sat through, as I'm sure you have in our careers, right? Many programs where I am like, is anybody else ever going to talk but the facilitator, right? And so when I get that feedback of like, yeah, the stories were a little long, I'm like, I know the importance of stories, And I look for that feedback of the stories were really impactful, but I also look at, some of the stories were long-winded, and okay, well, I really need to be conscious of that and cut those down. So I think that's one of the primary things I've taken away, um, from a facilitation standpoint from the military is the majority of it is really hands-on. Let people fail, let people make mistakes, and I think
Mm.
that's so important.
And it's interesting that you speak of failing and making mistakes
Oh
because
yeah.
it's, and now that I spoke it out, it makes sense because you want them to fail and make mistakes early in the outdoors classroom or in the application and the training so that they don't do the mistakes later where they can be deadly.
Well, and it's in a safe environment, and it's interesting because I gathered some data, never published it, but I gathered some data a number of years ago where when role play video applications started started launching, and in fact, I utilized the very first one. It was very rudimentary. It was primarily a web based application that used your camera, and you would challenge the individual to present something, and they would present it, and then somebody could review it and score it. And so over the course of a few months, we had a number of programs, and we ran a couple hundred people through them. And what we did was, at the end, it was a 1 day program. So it was fairly concise. And at the end of the day, we would say to folks, okay, you're going to go ahead and you're going to now practice what you've learned with a peer. Now, what do we know about that scenario, Miriam, right? If you and I are paired together and do a role play, the feedback I'm going to give you is going to be glowing. Oh, it was awesome. It was amazing. You know, the feedback you give me is then going to be even better, right? That's just the reality. But then and so we scored those. So, oh no, let's just say. So then what we did was, and we sort of tricked people, because at the beginning of the morning we said, okay, we want you to load this application on your iPad. It was actually, now I'm saying, it was an iPad app, and now put the iPad away. And we didn't revisit it till the end. So they practiced with the peer, and then we said, okay, what we want you to do now is open up the application. There's going to be a record button. Now, before you hit that record button, know the following. You're going to have one opportunity to do your role play. It's going to record it. When you're done, you're going to hit stop, but you only have one chance. Go find a quiet place to do that. And when you're done, come back. So everyone comes back to the classroom. At that point, we then said, okay, now you're going to have a second opportunity to record it, but this time you can record it as many times as you like until you have one that you like, and they could review their own. And we're going to give you 10 days to do that. And we then scored on a rubric all of their videos. So we had a chance to see, how did they perform, and I'm going somewhere with this. How did they perform at the one they did in the classroom? And then how did they perform and score on the one they did within 10 days later? And the scores were, I mean, we're talking it was on a 5 point scale. We're talking from averages that were around 2.6, went all the way up to about 4.3. And the question that begged was, and this is a sales group, so the question that when I presented the data that we asked was, without that tool, where is that practice taking place? That practice is taking place in front of customers.
Mm.
And so this notion of, being able to get better with practice versus in a safe environment, being able to watch yourself. And we know we tend to be more critical of ourselves than anyone else is ever going to be, right? And then we look at that. So the reality is, that safe practice has huge benefits. Let people fail, let
Mm.
people make mistakes. We also asked people as part of the survey, how many times on average did you record it? And the average was around 7 times. And we also then asked, at what point when you were viewing it, on what number do you feel you had mastered the message? And it was around 4. So we went back and asked folks after. We said, if you mastered it at 4, why did you, on average, continue to record a few more times? And people started getting nitpicky. They said, well, the message was clear, but I didn't like my intonation here. I didn't like my tone here. I mean, think about the value of that. But again, they're doing that in a safe environment. And it can be difficult to do that in a classroom just because of time. Like we didn't have the time to allow people
Mm.
to do that. And I would worry that the feedback they'd get would just be too positive anyways.
So there's so much to unpack. One is, how can we, so what does it take for a group to actually give candid feedback and just leave the fluff out? So to be really kind to each other, and by kind, I don't mean nice,
Mm-hmm.
but to have each other's growth in mind. So this requires a lot of psychological safety.
It does.
And I think if we can get a group there to really be honest with each other and say, you know what, it was okay, but I think you can do better.
Mm-hmm.
If you change your intonation here, if you smile there, if you change your body language, and if we can get at this point, then I get it would just skyrocket the
Yeah. And I think over a few thousand, attendees facilitating and companies, I think there are a couple primary factors. One is it unfortunately or fortunately, it's very cultural,
Yes.
right? If they live in a culture of zero tolerance, they may be very uncomfortable to correct other people. So that's one factor. The other factor that again, this is my observations only. The other factor that I have seen impact a lot really has to do with experience.
Mm,
I had a group last week, and one of the things so they were not the highest level account representatives in the organization, but they're in roles where the majority of them have been in the industry a minimum of 10 years. They're more experienced. It's a higher level individual, and they were more than willing to not only recognize the good work but also talk about upgrades. I tend to use the term upgrades. I picked that up at Berkeley when I was getting my executive coaching certification. I thought it was brilliant. So instead of saying, what could they do better, I say, what are some upgrades, which I love
mm,
that term. And so my experience is the less experienced groups are more apprehensive about giving feedback about what could be done better or different.
mm.
The more experienced folks I see are more willing to do that. Again, assuming the culture is not completely negative towards that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then I wondered, to what extent is it then a different curve? I can imagine that in the beginning you learn about the content. So you do a sales pitch and you want to get all the words, so all the information, all the
Yes.
words. So you practice that, and then you get all the words, and then suddenly you forget to smile, and then you forget about your body language and about the intonation, and then you have the body language and the intonation and the smiles, and then you forget about your authenticity, right? So, so
Right.
I have the impression that there is a different learning curve where at the end you can then really make it your own. But to get
And
there, it,
and that's where the difference is
yeah.
to when you make it your own. Right? We start with and folks will say, I don't like role play. And I'm super passionate about this. I'll say, why? Why don't you like role? Well, because it's not realistic. And I'll be like, oh my gosh, imagine that. No one ever said role play was designed to be realistic.
Mm,
Role play is designed to allow you, to your point, for that progression. First is mastery of the content. That's where you start. Once you've mastered the content, then you move on to, what is my tone and what is the way in which I'm presenting it. And ultimately, you move on to then you make it your own. But you can't do that if you don't do that in a classroom or in a program or even with a tool afterward. You are left with mastering that in front of your customers, and that's never going to be a good thing.
mm. Do you think that the same will apply? Because we're speaking about sales training, right?
On this, we are.
Would you think that the same applies to facilitation?
Yes, because yes. So I thought you were going to say applies to other functions because I do a lot of leadership and management development, and we do a lot of the same thing, right? When I do coaching, developmental coaching with leaders, we have to practice, and I put them in workshops.
Yes, and I wouldn't argue about the role play. I think role play is always valuable,
Hmm.
and I do believe that it's funny because it gets us mentally in a situation of excitement.
Yes.
And we take on these roles and we do become these roles, although we know that it's not real. So I totally buy that. I don't know what happens
Right.
in the brain, but it works. What I was referring to was first you have to master the content and then you have to be authentic. And I wonder whether both in leadership and facilitation, I think the two are very often the same, actually.
Hmm. Agree.
Um, According to you, is it still the content that comes before that we first have to master the content?
Yes, and I'm careful with answering this question because I have to reveal that the majority of the content that I deliver, I design. And I know that's not always common, right? So I'm at an advantage. I should say this: I'm at an advantage in the beginning because I have an instructional design. I have a master's in instructional design, so I do design or redesign or customize the majority of the content that I'm delivering. So my familiarity with that content is pretty significant. However, when I am in a situation where I am preparing to deliver content that I did not design or that I'm not familiar with, I absolutely start there. I want to understand everything about the content. What is the, what are the learning objectives? What are we desiring to achieve? How does the content support the achievement of those learning objectives? So I want to first be completely familiar with the content, but then I have to practice it in order to make it my own.
Mm.
So I personally always start with the content.
And it's I just realized that there are different layers. And again, there's I have the impression that every step we take, there's just this deep dive where we can peel all the layers. One observation is there's process facilitation and there is the facilitation of training.
Hmm.
And of course, if you facilitate training, you do want to know what you talk about
Yes.
because the reason you're there is to bridge a knowledge gap.
Hmm.
So you want to know the content, of
Hmm.
course. If you're, and I wonder actually whether it's ever a good idea to 100% deliver someone else's content. I find this very dangerous because I think it's very difficult to make someone else's content really approachable and interesting and to be enthusiastic about it.
Um, I I believe, and I have seen it done, and I believe it can be done. I think that what needs to be understood is when when I am training other facilitators to deliver my content, it's absolutely somewhat of an arduous process. They don't get the content, look at it, and then I walk in to evaluate them. All right. So let's say it's a 2 day program of content. I will spend 4 days with them initially, one on one, going over that content. Well, first of all, prior to that, they have to observe the program being delivered. Then I will spend 4 days with them going through that content, watching them practice, talking about, are there examples or stories here that don't resonate with you?
Mm.
Can we come up with some of your own? Then they observe again. Then I will observe them delivering a portion. So I mean, it is not a quick process. My concern, Miriam, is that probably too often it's, here's the content, study it. If you have any questions, let me know. And that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
probably the way it's done most of the time.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
like that you emphasize that they shall come up with their own examples and anecdotes because this is then how it lands and that makes it real.
It does. It's
And
difficult to
then this
deliver.
will resonate with the learners, and they will come up with their examples and resonate with it.
Well, and there's so much of facilitation that's about passion. There's
Mm.
so much of being a facilitator that is passion. And what I love, one of my favorite compliments on the times I get it is your energy is incredible for that amount of time. So you have to be passionate about what you're delivering. And and it's difficult sometimes to deliver other people's stories and
Mhm.
examples
Yes.
as passionately as you would your own, which is why I ask, facilitate, let's search for something that you've experienced that falls in the same bucket. And I would rather stretch their story to meet it
Hmm.
than say, well, just deliver this one
Yeah.
that you're used to
Yes.
seeing.
And somehow the image that comes to my mind when I think of passion is Tony Robbins.
Yes, I'm such a huge fan.
Right? It's you, if someone else would just take the content, I mean, the content of Tony Robbins is great, but you cannot just take it and put someone else on stage and say, do it.
Mhm.
It takes the personality. Um, and I think there's for me, that's why I was asking the question about leadership and facilitation versus the training and the content, because when it comes to process facilitation and or coaching, group coaching, so what Tony Robbins does is kind of a process facilitation. So
Yeah.
everyone in the space is doing the work. He's
Yes.
just asking questions and speaking out invitations.
Mhm.
And I wonder whether for this, the content really comes first, or the presence, the passion, the enthusiasm, the experience.
Well, I will share this with you, and we can dig into this now or dig into this later. Um, I'm a firm believer if you put mediocre content in the hands of an incredible facilitator, the group will have an amazing experience.
Mm.
You can put the best content in the hands of a poor facilitator, and they will view both as poor. And I have, so do you want me to share the data I have on this?
Please, we love data.
So and it's anecdotal and unexpected the way it came about. So there was a program that I was responsible for, making sure it was delivered. I actually was not a facilitator for the content, but I was responsible for always being there when it was delivered. So I had seen this program delivered probably around a dozen times over a couple of years by two facilitators who had done an amazing job. And to give you the data, we'll just say this: the level one feedback, right? Kirkpatrick level one, the smile sheets at the end of the program. On average, the facilitators were scoring about a 4.8 out of 5. And the value of the program was scoring a 4.6. So within 2/10 of a point. We had a situation where neither of those facilitators were available, and another facilitator was sent in to deliver the program. Now, I observed the program, Miriam, like I had the previous dozen, and I can tell you that the facilitator delivered the content in the same manner, exactly with the same process, didn't miss anything from, my perspective, having seen it a dozen times. The facilitator scored a 2.1. The value of the program scored a 2.3.
Bam.
And
Yes.
I looked at that and thought it was like something that I probably knew, but like had never really stopped and thought about it. And the reality is the facilitator will absolutely drive the opinion of the value of the program, regardless of sometimes how strong or how mediocre the content is. But I was floored because I knew that the facilitator, now I'd never seen this facilitator before. As you can guess, I never saw them again because I didn't allow them to facilitate after that for our organization. And what I understood was that from someone who knew this person said they're actually a really good facilitator. They must have had a really off day, and I trust that there may be some accuracy to that. But I never, so I anticipated the low scores for the facilitator, but I never anticipated the low scores for the
Content.
overall program, and
Mm.
that they were both within 2/10, just reversed, right? We
Yeah.
went from a 4.8 facilitator and a 4.6 program value to a 2.1 facilitator and a 2.3. And so that's why I tell folks you can give mediocre content to an incredible facilitator, and those folks will leave and they will rate that, not only the facilitator high, they will rate that program
Yeah.
high.
And there are a few things that come to my mind that would um, underline or make sense of this result. One is, how much of the content can we really remember? As learners, we have such a short attention span. So I think the few things that we remember, so it's not about the content anyway,
Yes. Yes.
because we cannot retain it. And the second thing that crossed my mind is related to food. If I imagine that if I go to a star restaurant, then yes, the food is amazing and the way it's presented, and it's served on the dishes and with the cutlery that all goes together, and it enhances the experience.
Yes.
If I order the star menu home and it comes in plastic boxes, and then I put the food, might, even if it's brought in glass containers, but then I put it
Yes.
on the paper plate,
Yes.
the food is maybe the same, but I wouldn't rate it to the same degree because it just doesn't, the experience is not the same, and hence it doesn't taste the same. And I
I
think
love that analogy. Oh, I'm going to reuse that one if you don't mind. I really enjoy it is so true. It's the experience, right? It's about the experience. And the facilitator is largely responsible for that entire experience, you
because
know.
the facilitator, as much um, as the host in a restaurant, or how do you call, is it a server?
The servers, yes, the
Yeah,
servers. Yeah.
they make you feel good about yourself.
Hmm.
And I think to
Yes.
train a facilitator, they also do that if they really master their skills.
Yeah. I do have one other comment, and I feel like I hope we're not going too off, or I hope this flow is working for you. Because you raised an interesting question or interesting point of people forget the content. And I'm typically delivering programs that are multi-days, usually on average, they're 2 full days. And, my biggest concern as facilitator is they leave the program, they think it was of huge value, and then they go home and they take the binder, and the binder goes on the shelf. And so I hit that up front. I let people know. I say, what typically I will ask the entire group. What happens with the binder? Even if at the end of the program you're like, this was awesome. I learned a ton. Where's the binder go? And people say it goes on the shelf. So I do the following, and I've been doing this, I would say, for about the last 4 to 5 years, but I do it now religiously. I'm always a big proponent of, if there's something I do all the time, I must find it of value. So, and I let folks know this at the beginning of the program. I'll say the most important thing you're going to do, I'm going to tell you now. At the end of today, I'm going to ask you to write down one thing on the cover of the binder that resonated with you. And then we go around the room and everyone shares. I ask them, tell us what you wrote down and why. What about it resonated with you? Then we do the same thing on the end of day 2. So let's say it's 2-day program. So then at the end of the program, I'll say, now, don't leave and boil the ocean. You can't boil the ocean, right? You might have seen 20 things that you thought were awesome. But the reality is, even all the things that I've talked about, I as much as I'd love to lie to you and tell you I use all of them, I don't. There's just too many here. So when you leave here, take those two things, put them on a sticky note on your computer, so you see them every day. Work on those two things. Integrate them into your process. Work on mastering them. Might take 3 months, might take 6 months, might take a year. But work on mastering those things. And then once you have and they're second nature, then go back to the binder and maybe pull out another tip or two. Because what I find is, and I let folks know this is, you know, different things resonate during a program with different people. And it's all about, I saw this, and when I ask folks really, when I ask them why did it resonate, what they're not saying is, I saw this and I'm comfortable with attempting to implement. I'm comfortable.
Mhm.
I think this is something that's comfortable to me that I could get behind.
I
And
love
I do
that.
some exercises. I do some exercises like that where we'll have a list of things and we'll talk about. I'll put them into groups and I'll say, no, no, no. Here's the thing. When we come back, each of you are going to have different lists of things that you think work. And I'm going to ask, we're going to go around to each group as they report out. So let's say item number 3, group 1 said, "Oh, I think that's true. I think it can work in our business." And 2 and 3 didn't agree. So I'll ask somebody in group 1, sell it to us. Sell it to
Mm.
groups 2 and 3. Now there might be people in group 2 or 3, and I'll go to them and I'll go, who's comfortable with that? A few people raise their hands and go, now that it's been presented that way, I could do that. But other people will say, I can't get behind that. I'm like, and then don't try to sell it that way, because you have to be passionate, you have to believe it. So I always do. I do that with every single. If I forget to do, it's one of the things that I'm like, if I forget to do everything, I remember to do that. We go around and I say, take those 2 things, leave with those, and work on those.
I think that's a great strategy. And what I love about what you said is this: we only retain that what feels comfortable. And yes, it makes so much sense because we do have light bulb moments. And how often does it happen? For me, especially in coaching situations where we throw off ideas, we discuss about what could be done, what could work. And there's a difference in resonance with the coaches. Sometimes they're like, oh, yeah, that's a really good idea, but there's something not moving in their expression. And these are like, it's a great idea and it's so daunting and it's not me. Something doesn't
Yes.
sit well. And other times I share an idea and they were like, oh, yeah. And this is the moment where they can picture themselves doing it,
Yes.
implementing it. And then they get excited. And then this will also stick.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
haven't made the connection to it must be something that they feel comfortable executing.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and then for us as facilitator, for me as a facilitator, what I'm looking for is the greater variability of that list. Because what I
Mm.
want to know is, if everybody says the same thing, I have to ask myself the question of, did I only deliver that impactfully? Right?
Mm.
That's what I
Yeah.
look for. So I look for a list that's varied, because at the end of the day, not everyone, the majority of folks are not going to land on the same thing being comfortable. So I'm looking for a highly variable list. And then I'll say, what you noticed is, there were some commonalities, but you heard a lot of different topics mentioned. That means that each of you is taking something that you're comfortable with, that you feel you can deploy.
And I think, especially in the domains of facilitation, leadership, sales, where
Mhm.
it's a lot about our personality,
Mhm.
then if the group is diverse,
Yep.
and that's also the beauty of it. And
Yeah.
that's where a good salesperson is a good salesperson because it's authentic and they're passionate about
Yes.
it.
Absolutely.
And the same is true for a leader and a facilitator.
Yeah, and with leaders, it's very similar. At the same time, usually when I'm working with an organization, so I spent about 9 months when I first left industry and went into consulting. I spent about 9 months looking at all of the research on leadership development programs, both academic, industry, hybrid. There's a ton of meta-analyses. It goes back 50 years. It's an incredible amount of data. And narrowed that down to the 20 most critical leadership and management competencies. So normally when I'm working with an organization, we go through that list and I ask them, well, I first ask them, where do you think your biggest gaps are? I then conduct a diagnostic and analyze the data to determine, because about half the time they're right and about half the time they're a little off, right? As to what the real problem is. And so then we prioritize those skills, the delivery of those, to meet what the most immediate needs are. Although I will be honest that the same 2 always bubble to the top as the most immediate critical. One is coaching, right? Leaders are successful, success as a leader is predicated on the success of your individuals. So they have
Mm.
to know to coach. And then the other one is interviewing and hiring, which is if you don't hire the right, if you don't really know how to find the right people during an interview, uh,
Yeah.
you're, you're probably going to fail.
And then it's so funny. Whenever I look at leadership skills, leadership programs, for me, it all boils down to facilitation, because the other skill I think is psychological safety, which might be similar to coaching, but it boils down to asking the right questions,
Mhm.
being curious enough, being a service of the other, listening to understand, listening to the unsaid. Um, and then what you said, hiring is also about understanding body language,
Mhm.
reading people, putting them at ease,
Yeah.
making them feel safe so that they can show their true self and maybe take a little bit of a risk. Facilitation skills.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you do any of the, do you do a lot of leadership training on your side?
Yeah, and we call it facilitation. So facilitation, leadership through facilitation.
Ah,
Yeah,
oh, okay.
yeah.
All right. Excellent.
Because I think there, I mean, there are many, there are also leadership skills that are more on the analytical side.
Hmm.
So how do you analyze the data? How do you listen to the data? How do you accumulate it? And how do you take decisions?
Yeah, I tend to put those in the managing bucket, right? I do make a distinction between there's
Yes.
leading and managing, right? And the epidemic is where we have far too many management tasks we put on folks
Mm.
today that doesn't really open their time to lead.
Oh yes, because leading you cannot rush through the leading. You can rush through managing, ticking boxes, but
You totally can.
leadership takes presence,
It does. It's
and you
not a
need to slow
spreadsheet.
down.
It's not an email.
Uh,
It's
Thinking,
a
speaking, listening,
yeah, listening. It's
landing.
one-on-one interaction. Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
would agree.
fascinating. What have you learned of leadership from the military? Because that's a very different leadership style, which is maybe
Yeah,
less facilitative.
the one thing I probably share most often, and it's solely for the shock value, is when I'm meeting with an organization early on, I'll say, I have background in the military, and I'll say, let me ask you a question. Obviously, leadership is important in the military, and it is everywhere. But in a 20-year career, how much time do you think an officer, let's say, will spend developing their leadership? So you take a 20-year military career, and I'm curious as to your guess. Take a 20-year military career, how much of that time do you think will be spent solely working on developing their leadership skills?
Hmm. And I would think that it's actually a lot more than in the corporate world, because leadership in the military, without leadership there is not much, and
True,
people
true.
trust their lives.
Yes. So there is a different context, and
Yeah,
I do recognize that. But what would your if you took a stab at it?
I have no idea. So 20 years is a lot. So in a year I would spend a month, 2 months to work on their leadership.
Okay, so if you spent a month a year, that would be 20 months, which would be, a little under 2 years. On the
Mm.
higher end, you're closer. So
Oh.
somebody who spends a 20-year career in the military will spend a total of 3 years in programs developing the leadership. So that alone, Miriam. So I asked a question last week, and somebody said, 2 days a month, and we extrapolated that out, and it was way short, right? So I said, and here's the other thing that's amazing. The large majority, in fact, almost all of that time, they will be in programs where they don't have a job to do.
Yeah.
They're 100. So
Yes.
most major leadership development and programs in the military that you will go through, because this is just formalized you're attending, right? There's a bunch of other things that extend that number, but most of these are in between assignments. So you're leaving one assignment, you might go to a program for 6 months. Or, when you go to the war college, whether it's the Army, Navy, or Air Force, that's almost a year. So that adds up to about 3 years. And so I'll say to organizations, ask yourself, how much time are you committing to the topic of leadership and management development? And even though we know and we can admit that maybe it requires more in the military, the reality is, Miriam, most of the organizations I'm talking to, it's almost non-existent. And I think at least they'll admit that. They'll say, well, look, we do a couple days here and there, but it's not an organized program. And so I asked the question for the sole purpose of leading into a discussion about not only its importance, but that leadership and management development is a never-ending journey, right? I consider myself an absolute student of leadership, and there's 4 or 5 books I'm looking at right now on the shelf that I'm in the middle of or rereading, right? And so it's a continuous journey. But I also treat all of my skill development and work with clients the same way, which is, as much as I hate turning down business, because I am a consultant and I am working 100% commission, the reality is when somebody comes to me and says, hey, we have this meeting coming up, can you do 4 hours? I hate saying no for the money, but I'll say no. I'm interested in a long-term relationship of continuous development where we understand and agree at the beginning, here's what the gaps are, here's where the organization is, here's where we want to go, and here's what we need to do. Here's those gaps we need to fill, and that's a long term. But I do work with what I do with both leadership and management development and like advanced selling and even executive coaching. They're long-term relationships that there has to be a continuum. It's not a one and done, and because there's no impact that way.
Yeah. And it comes back to what we discussed earlier on about the concept of learning and development versus training.
Mm-hmm.
So you never arrive, because learning and development is also the inner journey. And I think especially for leaders, it's so much how you show up with your own shadows.
Oh,
Because
of course.
and that's what I often realize with the training on psychological safety that we do, where to create psychological safety for others, it starts with creating it for yourself and feeling safe yourself. Because if you don't feel safe, then this kind of insecurity, uncertainty, you pass on to your direct reports, to your teams.
Absolutely. And think about how that, you just made me think of something. Think about how that is as a facilitator. I think sometimes folks, facilitators, make the mistakes of, I'm heading into this program that I'm facilitating or this content, and there's this elephant in the room that I'm worried about, but I'm not comfortable. I'm not going to bring it up, and I'm going to hope it won't come up. And I don't do that at all. I go right at it, and sometimes with my work, most often, if I had to think of one topic that would resonate, that I could explain, a lot of times I'm training folks on skills, on advanced skills, that as I'm doing my diagnostic interviews prior to, I'm starting to pick up, do these people really know this is a responsibility of theirs? Mm-hmm. So, it may be something like, I'm getting ready to go in and teach and facilitate a program on calling on C-suite executives. And I start doing interviews and I hear, well, we're so busy, and they've sort of hinted that this is a responsibility, but we're not really calling on the C-suite, and I'm not really sure we have time to do that. Well, that's a problem for me, because I'm getting ready to come in and spend a couple days with them talking about techniques and tips and tricks and processes to both not only get C-suite meetings, but also what you do when you're there, how you prep. So I go to the leaders and say, look, either prior to, and ideally prior to, or immediately at the beginning, like, here's what I'm picking up. I'm picking up that folks aren't really sure this is part of their job. They kind of need to feel that way before they sit for the for this program. And so I am a big proponent of when you discover those things, because that creates safety for you. I don't want to be facilitating. That's where I was going with this. I don't want to be facilitating fearing, is this going to come up, or when it comes up, how am I going to handle it? I knew it was a potential I knew it was going to make me uncomfortable as facilitator. So I'm going to go right out and say, hey, this is a problem.
Yes. Because otherwise your discomfort, it will spill over to everyone. And I think it wouldn't be true to our main task, which is, I think, we come there to make the implicit explicit.
Yes.
That's what we're
Yes.
supposed to do, especially when we're working with leadership teams.
Very much. Very much.
And then if we are not living that promise, we can stay home. Then we let the elephant lead the meeting,
Right.
right?
Right. Let the elephant run the training. Yeah.
Yeah. In your experience, what makes a workshop fail?
um, Poor facilitation. Maybe poor content, or a combination of those two. But as I've said before, I would rather have poor content and an exceptional facilitator every day of the week.
Mm.
Um, but I think beyond that, that to me is the first one. Beyond that is the mix of workshop and practice versus didactic.
Mm.
Um, I think that, and I might not go as far as say fail, but the impact's just not going to be there. I look at every, I try to deliver. I mean, I don't know, the general design of the programs I deliver it's modularized, and each module I would say is anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour and a half. That's probably the typical time of a module. And so I'm looking to ensure, is there at least one activity, ideally two, right? One of those activities might be on the low end, it might just be ensuring there's a discussion, which I think is the really low end. The other one is there an individual activity that they're reporting out, they're preparing something, and we're, hopefully having everybody demonstrate, or at least a large part, and a group exercise where they're breaking out into groups and they're reporting out. I also do a lot of, because I don't use slides, I'm a big flip chart. So my typical design. It reminds me, today I'm flying out tomorrow for a program, and I have to make sure they have flip charts. Last time I went, the ones they had previously were used. So I try to, from a logistics standpoint, I tend to have programs where there's 5 people per table, and every table has a stand-up flip chart on an easel. So they do a lot of work on that. It gets them up out of their chairs. They're writing, they're putting stuff down, they're sharing it with the group. So I think the mix of interactive versus didactic is really important. If there's
Yeah.
too much didactic, it's a problem.
Yeah. Then again, we cannot capture and remember all of that. It's too much didactic.
Yes. Oh, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
And your first answer was poor facilitation. So what is poor facilitation?
That's a question. Yeah, let me think about that a second. Um, I think the things that come to mind, so these might not be in order of priority. Um, the facilitator not being familiar with the content is a killer, right? If they're muddling through it and they're not familiar, I think you just see it right away. So I think that's number one. Or one of the top ones. The other top one for me is passion. And maybe I'm a little bit, that's a very personal answer, because I believe that passion goes a long way, and it's one of the things that I really try, and it's one of the things that I'm fortunate to get probably the most feedback on. You have to be passionate and in the moment as a facilitator. People, they may not notice that if you're not, they may not be able to put their finger on it, but I know they want to enjoy it.
Mm.
So I think the passion of facilitator, I think interactivity, um, I think those are key. I think those are key. And well designed content is obviously, the other thing. Not only the familiarity, but the content has to be designed well. I mean, again, I am a, from an education standpoint, I guess you'd say professionally trained, right? I'm a big believer in learning objectives need to be correct learning objectives, and the way the content's developed needs to meet those. I think that's a sound process. And it's one of the things that, it's funny because Miriam, I had been in learning and development for a number of years before I decided to go back and get my master's in education. I'm 56 years old. I got my master's 10 years ago. So
Mm,
I was in my mid to late 40s, and it was really eye-opening. I think my team maybe didn't love it when I came back. Because I realized that, just because you understand what ADDIE is, or just because you understand a concept or two, does not make you an instructional designer. Right. And so I had a lot of people that I kind of went back and looked at, and I'm like, there's a lot of improvements that could be made in the way we're designing content. And I had jobs, and I think the reason I decided to go back was I had reached a level where I felt like it was really important for me to have more expertise. But I also had director of training jobs where I had instructional designers, professional instructional designers, and jobs where I had not. And I saw
mm.
a significant difference in the quality of the content. And so I was like, I gotta understand this better. And it was really eye-opening.
Fascinating. On many levels. So first, I think it's a very courageous move to go back to uni.
Yeah, I was pretty old. I felt pretty old, I should say.
And I think it's great. And yeah, to design and I think also a lot has changed over the last decades, right? In terms of instructional
Yes.
design and how so back in the days, it was good enough to have a few slides and to just put all the knowledge in the brains of people. And now it's all about experience design, right?
And I was glad I had waited, because we had access. In fact, I had one class. I kept every book, and I'm looking at it on the shelf. I had one class where the book that we bought for the class was really old. And I thought, this is what people were learning 15, 20 years ago, when e-learning was brand new, right? When academia discovered e-learning, and eventually corporate picked it up and made it better. But we had this one text where I'm like, none of this applies today anymore. And so I remember thinking during that particular class, I'm glad I waited, because I was learning sort of what the new things were. Now, of course, it's now 8 years later, I think, technically, since I finished, and things still change. But I've because of that, it's made me aware of keeping abreast of what's changing.
Yeah.
Being aware of the changes.
What is the biggest misconception, would you say, of designing a training?
With um, Are you referring to, or would the rest of that question be designing a training when my impression is it's not sound from an instructional design standpoint?
Yeah.
Oh, I think often they start with the end in mind, which I'm a believer in, but how they methodically, there is no method to getting to that end. They look at it and go, here's what we need people to know how to do. And therefore, to do this, there are these tasks, but there's not a learning plan. They don't start with learning object. I always start with, okay, what's the end game look like? What is the skill we're looking to develop? And then I move to, what are the learning objectives? And I think that the design of the learning objectives is far more important than most people understand. It is not just making sure you're using the right words. I would argue, in using the right words to design your learning objectives, makes you think of the correct path to get there. So I
Mm.
think we tend to look at it and go, well, here's the skill. So I'm just going to give them some information. We're going to practice the skill. There's a much better methodical way of going about that.
And is this then also linked to the fact that by looking at the learning objectives, it has to be hands on at some point?
Yes, that's a great, yes. You know what? That's a great point. Yes. I think that by looking at the learning objectives, it does say, okay, well, because you're defining in the learning objectives, are you simply sharing information? Are is the action word discussion, or is the action word demonstrate?
Mm.
And
Mm.
so when you're designing learning objectives for a module, you realize, wait, one of these learning modules, I mean, one of these learning objectives, probably the last one, needs to be demonstrate, or some sort of, of level 3 or level 4, approach to that particular skill, where you're actually is it analyzing, is it demonstrating, is it presenting, whatever those are. So I think it does point you in the right direction. I can give someone, and I found over the years, I can even give somebody learning objectives who's not an instructional designer, and they will end up with a better, a better module, because at least I say,
Mm.
here's what the objectives of this session are, this module are. And so they'll say, okay, well, it's very clearly says we're going to evaluate this information. We're going to demonstrate this skill. So I think that there's a real benefit, and I've done that in the past, where I've been asked, if I'm not designing the content, especially for the organization I do a lot of work for. I'm the only trained instructional designer, so I will say, here are what the learning objective, let me give you the learning objectives, or let me look at your learning objectives,
Mm.
and I'll enhance them and say, here's what they need to be.
Yeah.
So, and I think that over time, that is a skill people can develop if they do it right as well. Because I work with some colleagues who aren't, educationally, professionally, trained in instructional design, but over time, they really have developed incredible skill if they take that process.
And it reminds me of, I wonder whether the learning objectives of a training is the equivalent of the purpose of a process workshop.
Yeah, I think they're one and the same. I think they're one and the same. What are you thinking of when you ask, like, you must have something in mind? What are you thinking of? What sort of process workshop?
A strategy, a group has to come up with a strategy. A group has to come up with the decision about the top priorities, or a lessons learned workshop where they debrief a post-mortem of a project, for instance.
Well, absolutely, because I'm just thinking, again, if you look at, if you're, familiar with Bloom's, you're looking at, are they analyzing, are they evaluating, right? Are they creating a new process, right? They develop, is the learning objective to develop a new process, or modify? Even modify is a Bloom's verb.
What is a
So
Bloom's?
so Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is essentially the list of verbs that, when you're writing a learning objective, like if I'm writing learning objectives, I have Bloom's up on the screen, and it
Mm.
lets me know. So you start with, from a Bloom's perspective, you start with, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to, there's 5 top categories, or 6 if I recall correctly. There's remembering, there's understanding, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. I'm missing one. Applying is the other one. So when I'm looking at what are we looking to do, there's this progression of, the first thing may just be to identify, right? So the first learning objective may start with the Bloom's verb identify, or describe, or define. Then we may move into understanding it, or we may move into analyzing it. The ultimate goal is to get to analyzing, or evaluating, or creating, or applying, but you don't always, right? Some of it's just to understand. But
Mm.
if I can get it to, at a minimum, applying or analyzing, then then that's the skill. If I can get them to apply the skill. So it might be something as simple as, um, you know interpret the data, you know, for this topic, right? And then we might be, okay, now that we've talked about interpreting the data and how to interpret it, now let's apply it by using it as a consultant. We're using it in a scenario, and let's demonstrate. So demonstrate might be the Bloom's verb. But yeah, when we're building learning, when I'm building learning, that's like the Bible of building learning objectives, is
Mm.
Bloom's taxonomy.
Yeah, makes total sense. And it starts with noticing, with awareness, basically. First have
Mm-hmm.
to be aware.
Right, of what you're doing, and it
Yeah.
should be a progression. Your first learning objective would never be demonstrate, right? We first have to explain, understand, potentially interpret,
Yeah.
even manipulate. I mean, there's a lot of options there.
Yeah. Huh, I'm glad that I'm asked. Thank you.
Absolutely.
What remains your number one facilitation challenge?
For me, I have to answer that question speaking from my perspective. My biggest challenge is ensuring that the delivery is customized and germane to my audience. I don't deliver off the shelf
Hmm.
content. I'm not known to deliver off the shelf content. So there has to be a process that I undertake to, and typically it's, I mentioned like a diagnostic. So I usually offer my clients one of two things. I either, and I let them know which I prefer. I'll say, well, I can do interviews or I can do a survey. Now, a survey gives me a lot more data technically, but I prefer the one-on-one interviews because I start picking up things and I do that. So customization of the content and ensuring that it's applicable. I as a facilitator know how to point it in the direction of application for my client or my attendees in the room is that to me is the most important. So, you know, that's and I have to, that sometimes that can take some time. So I have to
Hmm.
weigh that, right? And I have to weigh how much time do I have with my schedule to how many people can I talk to? What can I glean from them? I'm always trying to get the client. I'll give them a very uh, narrow criteria of the people I want to talk to, right? I want to talk to high performers, and I want to talk to some folks that you think have higher potential than they're displaying, but I don't want to talk to low performers. I don't need the complaining, right? So for me, that's my number one challenge is ensuring that the content is applicable because the clients and the attendees I'm in the room with are they're going to be pretty unforgiving if it's not, right? You'll see it right. They will say right away, like you read an evaluation, say, I didn't feel like this was related to our business. I didn't feel like it was related to what I do. So that's probably my biggest challenge. Um,
What's the challenge in that? The time?
the challenge there is, well, to me, the challenge is ensuring it happens
Okay.
because it's so
Mm,
critical,
yeah.
right? Because most of the content, as I said before, keep in mind, I'm fortunate, most of the content I'm delivering, I either designed or redesigned.
Mm,
So I'm very, I might, under other circumstances, say my biggest challenge as a facilitator is familiarity with the content. I think that's one of the biggest ones, but I tend to not face that.
yeah.
So for me, it's ensuring because I know that that's a requirement and an expectation of my audience, and it's pretty big requirement. So
Mm.
I know if when I'm delivering it, if they don't feel like I understand their business and that I'm relating it and I have an ability to relate it to their business, I know that the training, the feedback won't go well and they won't enjoy it. So
And
um,
I want to pick something up that you mentioned. You don't want to talk to the
yeah,
low performers because you don't want to hear the complaining. Would you
yeah,
mind elaborating on that?
yeah, and the back half of that I might I might restate, but I won't restate the front half. When I say a poor performer, when I train, and you probably maybe this will resonate. We talk about leadership development. When I train leaders, and we talk about segmentation, right? Segmentation being A, B, and C players, right? Your top performers, your ones that your average performers that pretty much are always doing what needs to be done, and then your poor performers. First of all, I always make sure folks understand um, those C players, those poor performers. If someone is new to the role and is just getting up to speed, even if their performance isn't there, but if their performance isn't there because of that, they're not a poor performer, right? They're still in the uptick. Um, and so it goes to the data around, can a C player become a B player? Now, the answer to that question is yes, and I wouldn't dispute that, but the data would suggest it's not very common.
Mm.
So the point is your time better spent with a C player in hopes, in the slim chance they'll become a B player? Or is that time better spent with a B player who has the potential to become an A player?
Mm.
So the reality is, I'm going to hear, well, here's what I know over time, Miriam, and you may explain it better. If there's a problem in the organization, the A players are going to let me know that. The top performers will tell me, here are the problems we have. They are not shy. The B players may not tell you. The C players are going to tell you, but part of the problem is they're C players for a reason. And in my experience over the years, not only as a facilitator, but more importantly in the 30 plus years of leadership and you know, at all levels that I have, is that the complaints and the problems that are perceived by the C players are very often not really true problems. They're just problems they're experiencing because they're an underperformer. So I am never worried about not hearing what are the challenges of the organization. I'm actually going to hear them from the A players, and they're going to be, generally speaking, they're going to be real, because the A
Mm.
players are performing well. They're going to tell you what's hindering the organization. So yeah, so there's no value for me in hearing, in my experience, there's no value in me from hearing from the C players, from the underperformers,
Yeah.
as I'm getting ready to understand the challenges of the organization, because their challenges are usually pretty specific to them, and it's not about organizational challenges. Did
Mm.
that answer your question? And was that surprising?
It does answer my question, yes, and it was your answer surprising. So the initial one, that you don't talk to C players, and I'm glad that I asked,
Yeah.
because it does make sense. I think there's also a big cultural aspect of, I'm thinking of living, working in Europe a lot, also with public sector. I used
Yeah.
to work at the university where you don't really get rid of C players,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
So
You're
it's not,
correct.
and then suddenly they play a very different role, because it's like you do have, there's a danger of infection. So
Well,
you,
that's
and then you better put emphasis there and see why are there C players? Is it the is it the right person in the wrong position, or is it the wrong person?
yes.
Yeah.
So we could talk for hours on this one, but yes, I talk a lot about that when you're evaluating your C players. When we do segmentation, I will say, are there C players that are just on the wrong seat on the bus?
Yeah.
Because if they're worth keeping, then should we be looking for some? Are they just in the wrong role?
Yeah.
If the C player is a C player because of poor leadership and management, then that's going to come out as well. But trust me, I'm going to hear that from the A players, because an A player is going to tell me, let me tell you something. We've got a problem with here's the feedback. Here's one of the issues we're having, and those folks may say we got some underperformers that could be better because,
Yeah.
but that's a different story.
And then the other thing that crossed my mind was that it takes a while to become a C player. So it's, unless you were a wrong hire.
Unless what?
You were a wrong hire. So someone hired the wrong person, and then they might be C from the
Of
beginning, but
course.
usually it's something is happening to this person so that they're degrading. Nobody starts with low performance. Um,
To your point, unless I think more commonly a C player is the result of somebody not being in the right role at all, or at times, and I see this more often, uh, they've they've been in a function and they've been successful in a function, but then they go to an organization where frankly the expectations are just more like, because I work in both, and I've personally, and I work with clients that are both in the corporate, and I mean in the large company setting and the startup setting, and
mm,
I see people move from corporate to startup and thrive, and I see them move from corporate to startup and absolutely struggle
yes.
because
Mhm.
it is a different environment, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Absolutely. So to know the entire context, but then obviously it's a different, it depends then also on what's the purpose of the training or the workshop
yes.
you're performing. And then I found it interesting because when I deliver a workshop And these are rather process workshops, so team workshops. And then I want to interview everyone who will be in the workshop, because if every voice counts, and if their voice doesn't count, then they don't have to be in the workshop.
Yeah,
And then I wouldn't call them low performers, but the complainers, they can give me very valuable information of what's going wrong and where the tension can be coming from,
true.
and how can I better understand them, and what is the reason for their nagging,
Hmm.
so that I can avoid them intoxicating the workshop.
Yes, which is right, which is always a concern. We didn't talk about that today, but concern as a facilitator. When you talk about one of the biggest challenges, as facilitators, it's if you have folks that don't want to be there, don't want to be engaged, all I'm really looking for is them not disrupt the rest of the group.
Yeah.
That's really my goal. And to be honest, I say that at the beginning of the program. I say, look, there may be some of you who are here that have to be here, don't want to be here. All I'm asking is that you not disrupt the group, because I really want to let them know, because they know who they are. And so I get at it right away on the morning, that the first, like I said, within the first probably 15 minutes, I've had that discussion of just please don't disrupt the group. There are people who probably are really excited to be here, and if you're not, I may not be able to change your mind, but I ask that you not disrupt the group. But every once we have this funny term we call them, and I don't know who coined this. Somebody in our groups called them loose electrons. So when we tend to talk to each other, we'll say, how'd the program go? Okay, do you have any loose electrons? And if we had one, it's usually an interesting story, right, about somebody that was disruptive, or and on rare occasion, I've had to pull an individual aside during a break and just say, I'm really sorry, but the approach you're taking to your comments is really starting to rub off. I think it's coming across as very negative. Not saying, I'm not interested in your feedback, but you may want to think about how you're delivering it.
Mm, yeah.
So
Yeah. And it's an interesting approach. And as I said, it really depends on what's the purpose of the session in the first place. Because sometimes nobody wants to be the disruptor. Yes, maybe they know who they are, but they always believe that they have the very best motives and the reasons to
they
disrupt.
do.
Right?
They do. They do. And sometimes I mean, one of I think our big goals as a facilitator is sometimes we're responsible for channeling that, in the right direction, hearing them, clarifying in a manner that makes it more valuable to the group, turns it from I just want to complain in the setting to let's clarify and let's talk about what does that mean for us, and is that something that can be changed, which isn't easy, because I would say a good portion of the time it's not something we're saying those words, but really I'm trying to kind of downplay that person, get them sort of their emotion down a little bit, and maybe redirect them in a manner that is either helpful to the group or just kind of fades that
Yeah.
negativity away.
Yeah. I was thinking either the disruptors who are complaining or those who know everything better. And I think in both cases, they don't feel heard. They need to be
Yes.
appreciated, some sort of sense. As you say, get the emotions down and see how they can be of a productive.
Yeah. And I deal with a lot of, I mean, it's more common in my programs to have those that know a lot. And a lot of times organizations will say, look, hey, just want to let you know you've got a lot of really experienced folks. And I think they're looking for me to sort of reel back. And I tell them, I say, actually, I prefer more experienced folks. And the reason why is because less experienced folks will sit through a program and they might give you great feedback and go, this was really awesome, but they don't know what to do with it.
Mm,
See, I prefer to have more experienced folks in the room where I'm sharing a concept and we're talking about it, and then I have folks in the room who know, well, this is where I would use this. Now that's a really robust conversation. So I always say to folks, the more experience, the better, because they know if they see something that they like or hear something they like, they know where to use it. And now they can share that with the group, because that's what I can't do. And I let people know I'm not a lecturer, a teacher. I'm not an instructor. I'm a facilitator. My goal is to share concepts, generate discussion, and or workshop and work on those concepts, and then so that we as a group are sharing where they apply in your business. Because no matter how much I know about their business, the reality is I don't do it every day, so I'm
Mm.
not going to really know. So I get it that early, so they know I'm not coming in as an expert in your business. I have some expertise in the concepts I'm going to share, but then we together need to figure out, where does this apply and what does it look like in your world when you apply it?
Yeah. Yeah. And then full circle back to it must be applicable, must be hands on,
Yes,
that they walk out with something that they can put on top
absolutely.
of their little how do you call it,
Their binder.
their binder.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. We've talked for over an hour.
Oh my gosh, we have. This has been awesome. Miriam, I really enjoyed this. This is, and I'll tell you, because I spend the majority of my time talking about leadership and management development and executive coaching and those, but I have so much passion around the importance of facilitation and facilitation skill. And it's so great to meet somebody and have, a conversation and hopefully an audience that, that this is what they're passionate about, because I'm just
Mm.
such a huge believer. I consider myself, first and foremost, I'm a facilitator. That's what I do. If I am not successful as a facilitator, I'm not going to be successful in my business. So this has been great. It really has.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I, yeah, loved the conversation. So much to take away. If that's a question that I used to ask at the end of every podcast in the beginning, I haven't asked it for a long time, but I think since we covered so much ground,
Yeah.
if someone fell asleep at the beginning of our podcast and just woke up, what would you like them to remember? What's the one thing that they put on their binder?
That to be impactful as a facilitator, you have to be passionate. And in order to be passionate, you have to be familiar, really familiar with the content. I think it comes back. I just think it comes back to that.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pat.
Miriam, thank you. This was such a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
And I will put all the information how to find you, how to reach
Awesome.
out and connect in the show notes.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope we will have a chance to cross paths again. I enjoyed this.
Dum, da, da, dum. I have to find the record button again. Here it is.